Hello everyone, this learning module, or this video accompanies the learning module on Reformation. What I'd like to do is provide some background to the larger social historical forces at the time that provide a context for a lot of what we read this week. The causes of the Reformation. Some have theorized that one of the main causes for the Reformation was a lack of interest in Christianity, or a decline in faith. Historical records have proven this is not the case. Investigations of attendance, church attendance from the 14th, 15th centuries reflect a real vitality in Christian life in Europe. The causes for the Reformation were much bigger than that and a little more complicated. Part of this was the expanded role of higher education. Increased access to higher education eroded the privileged status of the clergy. People began to pursue higher education in order to pursue secular professions, particularly law, medicine, civil service. Also at the time, there was a beginning for a call for what we could call critical inquiry in the role of religious life. Priests could not any longer justify his position simply by referring to their calling. During economic depressions, there was some very harsh criticism of priests. You have to understand during this time that people were taxed by the state, but also by the church. And this began to create quite a bit of tension between the citizens and the church, as well as between the state and the church. There's also conflict within the church at this time, and it certainly didn't help matters. The death of Pope Gregory XI led to what was called the Great Schism. It took place between 1378 and 1417. During this time, three individuals, rival individuals, claimed the right to the papacy. So people had difficulty looking with confidence to any one individual of these three in order to represent the authority of the church. And guidance during this time, particularly strong leadership, was important in light to all the challenges that I've just mentioned. Finally, Martin V was elected Pope in 1417, but some doubts still remained. Also at this time was a rise in nationalism among European states. Nationalism refers to citizens developing a sense of identity, a loyalty to their nation rather than to larger European culture. This led to the growing independence of Swiss and German states. Important to keep in mind, at this time, Germany was not a country. Germany did not exist as a single nation. Germany at the time was a collection of kingdoms, principalities, ruled by a number of different monarchs, authorities. They spoke the same language, and many of the same similar loyalties, but they were independent states. It wasn't until mid-1800s, late 1800s, under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, that Germany began to coalesce from a series of small nation states into one nation. But that didn't happen until mid-late 1800s. In fact, up to this time, when people would go to visit what we would call Germany, they would say they were going to visit the Germanies, plural. But as I mentioned, growing independence in Swiss and the German states. Reformation also had implications in England, and a lot of what happened in England fueled the Reformation, particularly the marital problems of King Henry VIII. In 1530, Henry VIII tried to divorce Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. Catherine of Aragon was Spanish. She was a daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen who funded Christopher Columbus' explorations. The reason for this, Henry wanted a male heir. His claim to the throne was, it was credible, but there were others who might have had an even better claim to the throne of England. Henry wanted a very clear line of succession to a male heir that would solidify transfer from one generation to the other. At the time, it was believed, but there was really no understanding of genetics, as we understand. And when the wife didn't bear a male heir, it was the fault at the time. It was believed to be the fault of the wife. By this time, Catherine of Aragon was past her childbearing years. They'd had several children, several miscarriages, a young son who died in infancy, and a daughter, but no living sons, just one surviving daughter. So Henry appealed to the Pope for annulment of the marriage. The annulment was necessary in order for him to marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn. Pope did not grant the annulment. In fact, he ordered Anne removed from the court while the case was under consideration, and that any children born to her up to that point would be considered illegitimate and could not inherit the English throne. This infuriated Henry, who was used to getting his own way. After considering the matter for about 3 years, in 1533, the Pope ruled against Henry, denied the divorce, and ruled that any children born of Anne Boleyn would be illegitimate. This positively infuriated Henry VIII, who was used to getting his own way, and later in life became quite tyrannical, sadistic. At any rate, Henry refused to accept this. So he pushed through Parliament. It's called the Act of Succession and Supremacy in 1534. Act of Suppression and Supremacy. What this meant was it made the monarch, the king, the head of the church in England. Now, it's important to keep in mind this distinction. Not Church of England, Church in England. Up to the day he died, Henry considered himself a good and true Catholic. Henry was not, and did not consider himself at all, a Protestant. He considered himself a Catholic, and he considered himself head of the Catholic Church in England. But refusal, everyone in the kingdom had to swear allegiance to this. Refusal to swear allegiance, to recognize the monarch as such, as the head of the church in England, head of the Catholic Church in England, was considered treason and was punishable by death. And at the time, the punishment for treason for citizens was particularly heinous. For those who were nobles, royalty, the penalty for treason was simple beheading. For non-royals, the mass population, the penalty for treason was first they would be dragged behind a horse by rope through the dirt streets because they were considered unworthy of breathing the same air as the rest of the population. So they would be dragged to the site of execution. Once there, they would be castrated. Then they would be hung by the neck, but not until they died. Then they would be taken down before they died. And then while they were still alive and conscious, they would be disemboweled. Their entrails would be burned while they watched, and then they would be decapitated. The bodies would be cut into 4 pieces, the limbs sent to the 4 different corners of the kingdom where they would be displayed publicly as a warning, and the head would typically be put on a spike near the Tower of London, where boats sailing in and up down the Thames would see it. It would be visible. So not only was this a really heinous type of death, it was designed to be humiliating. You can imagine why most people took the oath. There were, however, a group of monks, one of the monasteries, who refused to take the oath, and they were found guilty of treason and sentenced to death in the ways that I just described. Many consider them to be martyrs. Causes on the continent, continental Europe. Conflict between the church and the state grew out largely of economics. The church raised money through taxation and the sale of titles, indulgences, and titles for nobility, indulgences was a way of essentially buying one's way out of sin. Church lands, however, were not subject to taxation by kingdoms. So the king, the monarch, could tax all the lands in his or her kingdom except those owned by the church. You can imagine this created a great deal of tension between governments and church. All of this was drawn from the same nations. People wanted tax for government purposes, so that this was common across all the nations in Europe. So whatever money the Pope extracted from a kingdom and whatever lands were not taxable was essentially money withheld from civic and national uses. In 1300, papal supremacy over civil authority was asserted by Pope Boniface VIII. By that meaning, according to Pope Boniface VIII, his role as Pope superseded, came above that of any of the kings and queens in Europe. 1302, Philip, the King of France, secured from his parliament a denial of the right of the Pope to interfere in internal affairs of the nation. This was a response to Pope Boniface's claim that his authority superseded that of the king. And then in 1305, the French king succeeded in electing Frenchmen to the papacy. The masses largely supported the king, and this was one of the first mass protests, resistance of power to the church. Spain also began to push back. In 1381, Spain, which was one of the most conservative and closely adherent Catholic nations in Europe, set limits on authority of the church to tax its own citizens. Nationalism began to limit power of the church. People began more and more to define their identity not as members of the Catholic Church, but as citizens of their own nations. And the Reformation would take this further to a point where a number of independent national churches were established. Another blow to the church was the relocation of the papacy temporarily from Rome to Avignon, France. By moving, the church lost considerable prestige, was perceived as being a tool of the French king. Another resistance movement in the Germanies, 1338. The German Diet declared that the king derived his right to rule from God, not from the Pope, meaning the king inherited his right to rule. The king answered to God first, not the Pope. And this was another example of uprising against the papacy and support of nationalism. So I think that provides you with a large social context behind what's going on during this time. As usual, I'll be around. You know where to find me if you have any questions. Reach out to me sooner rather than later. And as always, have a good week, everyone. Bye.